Nyali Banjalangni Rakol Jugun Nyali Gani Garama Mala Jugun.
We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Banjalang people, on whose land Mullumbimby stands. We offer our deep respect to the elders past and present for their knowledge of how to live in harmony on this ancient land. I'm Pratima. I'm a local. I'm very passionate about alternative politics. And so all of these talks are going to go onto the Ngara Institute YouTube channel, because it's not just about Mullumbimby, it's really about the world. So without further ado, let's introduce Nick Rose. Nick Rose is the co-author and has been the national coordinator of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance since its inception in 2010. He led its engagement with the National Food Plan and jointly led and coordinated the development of the People's Food Plan, Australia's first crowdsourced food policy document. He also helped create Fair Food Week, which has become a focal point for the food sovereignty movement in Australia. He's the content director of Australia's first food politics documentary called Fair Food, which would be good to look out for. And he's also editing an anthology of Australia's Fair Food movement. So Fair Food, stories from a movement changing the world. And what an important movement it is if we haven't got enough food. Do we all know that it's only 2% of Australians that actually create all our food, and we still export, but a lot of them are really old farmers who are, not going to be with us that long. So more on Nick. He's also the executive director of Sustain, the Australian Food Network. Let's have a warm welcome for Nick.
All right, so I'm going to share with you a couple of stories. First is from this morning at the Shearwater Steiner School here in Mullumbimby, where Jane invited me to come and visit and speak with some students about the work that I do, and also to have a look at the farm project that's taking place at that school, to see the vision of a school and a community coming around 20 acres of land and making that a centre of sustainable food production, a whole working commercial farm, setting up a farmers market, setting up a food hub, seeing it as an opportunity to teach the students there about production, about care of the soil, about cooking and nutrition, about their bodies, about building community, and about how to build a sustainable local food system. Second story is, I guess, by way of introduction to myself and explaining why I'm here in front of you now, having done the things that I've done and doing the work that I'm doing. So I want to take you back to the year 2000 when my partner and I moved to Guatemala. We've been living in London and we moved to Guatemala to learn Spanish. Has anybody been to Guatemala?
Yeah. Okay,
all right, a few of you. So this will probably be familiar to you. To others, it may be news. So Guatemala in the year 2000 was 4 years out of a 36-year civil war that left 200,000 people dead. And as I discovered when I went there at the age of 33 in the year 2000, the reason for that brutal civil war was around food and questions of ownership and control of the fundamental resource on which we all depend, which is land. So now I take you back to the 1940s, and in the 1940s there was one corporation that basically ran Guatemala as its own private fiefdom. This was the United Fruit Corporation. That's the phrase, some of you might have heard the term Banana Republic. Banana Republic describes a situation that was in Guatemala and Honduras at that time when one corporation owned and controlled 80% of the arable land, ran the only railroad, controlled the ports, and used that land to grow fruit for export as commodity, and kept the majority indigenous people, the Maya, in situations of extreme poverty and disadvantage and hunger. So Guatemala, like many places in the world, in the wake of the end of the Second World War, when a wave of social democratic reformism was sweeping the planet, That wave also reached the shores of Guatemala, and there was what they called La Primavera Democrática, the Democratic Spring, 10 years in a 500-year history of essentially oligarchic colonial rule from the time the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s. 10 years from 1944 to 1954. And 2 waves of reformist government doing things like establishing a free healthcare service, free education, rights for workers, rights for trade unions, and then tackling the very difficult, thorny political question around the year 1950 of the question of who owned the land and what it was used for and who was benefiting from that system of land ownership and control. The United Fruit Corporation entered into negotiations with the Guatemalan government, which said to the company, look, it's not fair or right that you own 80% of our land and that you keep the majority of our people in conditions of extreme misery and hardship. We're going to embark on a program of land reform. What the Guatemalan government said to the United Fruit Corporation was that we are going to expropriate some of your holdings and redistribute them, and we're going to pay you, but because you have not really paid your fair share of tax, because you've underwritten the value of your holdings so that you can minimise your tax liability, we're not going to pay you the full market rates. We're going to pay you the rates at which you valued your land. So you might think, good on Guatemala, turning the tables on the United Fruit Corporation, La Frutera as it was called. Sadly, however, and this is a sad story, sadly for Guatemala, the CEO of that corporation had a family relative, a brother-in-law in Eisenhower's White House. He was the Secretary of State, Dulles. This was the time, remember, of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had not long come into existence, and what happened was the United Fruit Corporation said, had these discussions behind closed doors, said to the United States government, oh dear, look what's happening in Guatemala. The communists have taken control. The next thing we know, the Soviet Union will put a missile base in Guatemala, pointing missiles at the United States. This is a threat to our national security, something must be done. What they did was organise the assassination of the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Arbenz Guzman. They installed a military dictatorship, and then for some years later, a civil war began that left a toll of 200,000 people dead. And in the time when neoliberalism was just starting to really be implemented in full force, I'm talking here 1978 to 1982-83, Reagan was in the White House at that time. In control in Guatemala at that time was a dictator called Rios Montt. He was implementing what the Americans did in Vietnam, a policy in Spanish that's called tierra arrasada, scorched earth. What that means is that they colour-coded the country, and they said certain zones are red. Everybody in that zone is a communist, a guerrilla. They are marked for extermination. It doesn't matter if they're a pregnant woman, if they're a 95-year-old grandfather, if they're a 6-month-old baby. Everybody is to be exterminated, everything is to be burnt. They did that on over 300 occasions. And while they were doing that, while Rios Montt's army and paramilitary forces were going around the country implementing tierra arrasada, Ronald Reagan visited Guatemala. And what he said in an interview was that Rios Montt was getting a bum rap from human rights organisations. This is what neoliberalism is about. It's a policy of dispossession, of accumulation by dispossession and violence, and it's about restructuring relationships in society to benefit the powerful few at the expense of the many. But to understand neoliberalism, we have to go back a little bit further, because neoliberalism is really just the latest expression of capitalism. So you can't really understand and talk about neoliberalism if you don't actually talk about capitalism and what that is. So there's a lot of mystique, I think, about capitalism, and we use terms like the free market system or the profit system, but really I think we need to sort of dig a bit deeper and be a bit more specific about it, because, you know, it structures our lives and controls so much of the world around us. So capitalism is an historically specific form of organising human societies according to certain systemic imperatives, and it has a point in history when it began, and that was in Europe in the 15th century, and since that time it's been expanding and it's now become global. However, it's important to remember that it didn't just kind of, you know, come out of nowhere. It came out of certain processes and certain struggles. In particular, one was forcing people off the common land in England, the enclosures of the commons. People heard about the enclosures?
Yeah.
Another, which is also probably widely known, but not the extent of it or the purpose of it, is the witch hunt, the targeting and persecution of women in Europe. Assuming everybody here has heard of the witch hunt?
Oh, yeah.
Yes? Well, so had I, but until I read a book called Caliban and the Witch a few years ago, I wasn't aware that it went on for over 200 years and that over 20 million women were burnt at the stake across Europe. Wow. 20 million women. Now, the mythology of the witch hunt is that it was persecuting women for religious purposes, these women who were so-called consorting with the devil, with Satan, and who had knowledge of herbs and those kinds of things. But really, the thesis in this book, and if anybody's interested in this, I'd encourage you to read it. Her argument is that it had a very particular political purpose, an economic purpose, and that was to force women out of fields and artisanal and craft shops where they were working alongside men and put them back inside houses, and also take away their control over their own bodies and their reproductive systems, because the requirement of the new economy, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, required above all workers, required people to do the work. And so women's role in this new expanding economy was to produce the workers, was to produce the labour force, and that was the purpose of the witch hunt. So this lady argues, and I think it's a compelling argument. To this we have to add colonialism, imperialism, slavery and child labour, amongst many other things. And so I think of capitalism as a machine in many ways, a machine that operates according to certain laws of motion. Ellen Meskins Woods, in a book called The Empire of Capital, says that capitalism is driven by certain systemic imperatives: competition, profit maximisation and accumulation, and this inevitably requires putting profit before people. It has, she says, a unique drive for self-expansion. It cannot survive without constant accumulation. It's a system that must grow or die. So this has led to practices such as significant geographical expansion, which is still continuing today. There's a new wave of what they call neo-colonialism in the form of land grabs. Have people heard that term? It's hedge funds and financial institutions and sovereign wealth funds that are snapping up millions of hectares of land in Africa and Latin America, and even in Australia included, for commodity production. And it's also, you know, the endless commodification of life into all spheres of life, reducing everything to dollar signs and for exchange. So in terms of getting more specific and understanding what it actually is, Michael Howard and John King, in a book written in 2008 called The Rise of Neoliberalism in Advanced Capitalist Economies, a Materialist Analysis, identifies six key features, six core features of capitalism. First is the employment contract, and I know a bit about that because my first career was as a corporate employment lawyer. A contract for obedience, managerial prerogative. Secondly, highly refined institutions of private property. Thirdly, impersonal markets, where the primary economic bond is the cash nexus. Fourthly, substantial levels of market dependence, so that self-provisioning by individual households or small groups shrinks significantly. And this was, if we go back in history, the purpose of forcing people off the land, the enclosures of the commons, so that they became dependent on selling their labour power in order to live. And that is the system that we have today. Most of us, those of us who don't own land and produce our own food, do have to, as they say, work for a living. We have to sell our labour in the labour market in order to live. Fifthly, the promotion of individual acquisitiveness and the associated rationalisation of productive enterprises towards this goal. So that leads to the corporate form in particular. And finally, an infrastructural role for credit and the banking system. The provision of money and credit is necessary for all productive activities. So then if we look to neoliberalism, this is, as I said, a political theory and ideology, a particular regime of capital accumulation and a political project to restore class power. Harvey describes it as a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterised by strong property rights, free markets and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. So the things that we associate with neoliberalism are things such as deregulation, privatisation, and withdrawal of the state from social provision, which we're seeing very much today with the waves of austerity that have been implemented very harshly in countries like Greece and Portugal, and which we're now going to see in Australia, or we're seeing in Australia already. Neoliberalism, in terms of its ideology, has become hegemonic, or hegemonic as a mode of discourse. He was writing this in 2005. It has pervasive effects on ways of thought to the point where it has become incorporated into the common sense way of many of us interpret, live in and understand the world. And that's why it's so important to have evenings like this, where we can actually lift up some of the things that are hidden and submerged. When we talk about common sense, it's the norms and the assumptions by which most of us live our lives and which we take for granted, but we rarely examine and hold up to the light of day to critique. But that's what we need to do to really get a proper understanding, a critical understanding of the world we live in and why it is the way it is, and then to think, well, actually, should it be that way, and how could we make it different? So neoliberalism holds that the social good will be maximised by maximising the reach and frequency of market transactions, and it seeks to bring all human action into the domain of the market. So if we think back again to history and contextualise this a little bit, going back to the 1920s, we had an era of laissez-faire capitalism, the Roaring Twenties it was called, which culminated, of course, in the 1929 stock market bubble and then the Wall Street crash. And then we had the depression of the 1930s, mass unemployment, mass hardship, and I'm going to share with you what President Roosevelt said at that time in 1935, reflecting on the experience of the Great Depression. In the middle of it, remember, it still had some years to go. In his annual message to Congress in 1935, President Roosevelt made clear his view that excessive market freedoms lay at the root of the economic and social problems of the 1930s depression. Americans, he said, must forswear that conception of the acquisition of wealth, which through excessive profits creates undue private power. Everywhere, he argued, social justice had become a definite goal rather than a distant ideal. The primary obligation of the state and its civil society was to use its powers and allocate its resources to eradicate poverty and hunger, and to assure security of livelihood, security against the major hazards and vicissitudes of life, and security of decent homes. Freedom from want was one of the four cardinal freedoms he later articulated as grounding his political vision for the future. That's 1935. Of course, what happened after that was the Second World War. But then in 1945, there was a consensus, a political consensus really around much of the world around that kind of political vision. It was under the economic prescription of John Maynard Keynes. And it was about an interventionist state, it was about pursuing the goal of full employment, and the idea that the state was running society for the benefit of all people, and there was a balance of power between employers and workers. Trade unions were strong, working conditions were, on the whole, pretty good for lots of people. Society was by no means perfect, but it was a time generally of full employment. However, that model ran into difficulty in the 1970s, which many of you here will remember far better than I, a time of stagflation and crisis and political ferment. And what that did was create the conditions for new political ideas to emerge. One of the things that had happened by the 1970s is that trade union power had become so great that it was eating into the profits of companies and corporations. And while economies were growing, the CEOs could tolerate that, but when the economy stagnated and there was no longer economic growth, things weren't so good for them. So that is when the ideas of neoliberalism would actually have been formulated in Switzerland in 1947 by von Hayek and Friedman and people like that in the Mont Pelerin Society, were dusted off and came to the fore through a series of right-wing think tanks and working with political leaders such as Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States. And the political opportunity for implementing all this came with the election of Thatcher in 1979 and Reagan in 1980, but it had been tested previously in Chile in 1973 when Allende was assassinated and Pinochet came to power. Okay. So what's happened in the era of neoliberalism, and this here I'm drawing on the work of Robert L. Britton, who wrote a book looking at these big tendencies of capitalism and relating them to the food system. a book called Let Them Eat Junk, which was published in 2009. He identifies 6 major trends in the last sort of 30 or 40 years under neoliberalism which relate to the food system. So the first is time intensification, the increasing speed of production and labour productivity. I'm sure many of you here feel that, or I certainly do, the weeks kind of seem to be flowing by and speeding by, and this bizarre phenomenon of speeding up in time, it's no coincidence, because that's been a real structural imperative. We see it in agriculture in some instances, such as selection of livestock, breeds of chickens that have been selected for fast growing. So even the chickens that Joel Salatin uses are birds that reach their maturity within 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, and they can no longer walk because their breasts are so large. Spatial expansion and the homogenisation of natural and built environments. So we have monocultures, we have massive monocultures. 2 examples of that in agriculture in Argentina, where I was in 2014, nearly 70% of the arable land of that country, 47 million acres, are devoted to one single crop, genetically modified soybean. And that is Roundup ready, it's sprayed by the air. Most of that grain goes to feeding chickens and pigs in factory farms in Europe and China. In Argentina, what it's meant is a ongoing phase of rural depopulation, of clearing of savanna and natural ecosystems, and people being pushed into what they call villas de miseria, shanty towns on the edges of some of the bigger cities, and environmental standards are not enforced. So on one side of the road you have the soy plantation, on the other side of the road you have people living literally in cardboard shacks, and over the top you have crop dusters dropping glyphosate on people. So you see huge spikes in rates of skin defects and lesions and cancers and birth defects. It's absolutely appalling. There's a photo essay that was published last year called Argentina, the country that Monsanto poisoned, if you're interested in learning more about that. But also in our built environments. In Australia, we are familiar with the big box shopping centres, all structured around our so-called 2 friendly giants, Coles and Woolworths. The homogenisation of our retail and shopping environment. Thirdly, underconsumption and overproduction. So there's this ceaseless drive for expansion of production compared with the limited physical and monetary consumption capacity of workers, and that's been ameliorated to a certain extent by debt, by credit, which is another feature of the system in the last 30 years, people getting more and more into debt. What it's also meant in terms of overproduction is a massive problem of waste. Up to 40% of all food that's produced is wasted, which in turn is a huge driver of the climate change issue. Fourthly, concentration of capital in larger units, leading to monopolies and oligopolies. We know all about that in Australia, of course, with our supermarket duopoly. Fifthly, the production of individual subjectivity and extreme possessive individualism and atomisation, undermining social and communal ties. And finally, financialisation, the pursuit of short-term profit via speculation, asset inflation, and mergers and acquisitions. So, looking at some of the consequences for the food system of this particular form of capitalism called neoliberalism, what are they? Well, none of them are really great, I have to say. At the environmental level, we have waste, as I just mentioned, 40% of all food produced. There's a really good book written about this by a British author called Tristram Stewart. What a Waste, the Global Food Scandal. He's got a website, tristramstewart.co.uk, series of mind-blowing facts. Just one example is that the irrigation water that's used right now to grow food that is never eaten would be enough to satisfy the domestic consumption requirements at 200 litres per person per day of 9 billion people right now. So think about that the next time our governments tell us we're facing a water crisis and a crisis of fresh water, and we need to be on rations and all these kinds of things. How profligate is the use of the current food system just in relation to our water resources? Absolutely appalling. And yet it's held up as efficient and highly productive. Climate change, up to maybe 33 to 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions are linked to the food system, from paddock to plate and beyond. Land use change and biodiversity loss. We're in the middle of, so they say, of the 6th great extinction of species. A lot of that comes from destruction of habitats and ecosystems and deforestation, much of which is linked to agriculture, of course the Amazon being a case in point, but Also happening in Australia, I was in Cooktown in far north Queensland at the end of last year, where the Campbell-Newman government, before it left office, granted permission to clear fell 50,000 hectares of land on Cape York. And I visited one cattle station where that was being implemented in the most dramatic way through hooking up big chains, 100-metre long chains to 2 tractors, and just ripping out thousands of hectares of trees. That's how it's being done right now in Australia. Soil degradation and erosion. Having conversations earlier about this issue of the impoverishment of our soils, and Bruce put it very well, I think, when he said that, you know, through industrial agronomy and the full application of chemical-based agriculture, soil has become effectively sterile or even dead, and is simply, as he put it, a hydroponic system, a medium for growing food. I think of the consequences of that for our own health and well-being. If you reflect on the fact that as a species we co-evolved with the plants and the animals to absorb the nutrients in a really life-enhancing way, and not through the application of ever-growing quantities of chemicals. At the social level, we have a huge problem with loss of our farmers, 7 to 10 leaving the land every single day. And a lot of that is due to the fact that the disempowerment of farmers in Australia. 100 years ago, farmers got 90 cents, 80 to 90 cents of every dollar's worth of food they produced. Today, and these are the federal government's figures, not mine, that's around 10 to 15 cents. That's a measure of how disempowered farmers have become. There was a book published in year 2000 by the CSIRO, which said that Australian farmers in 1999 to 2000 had to produce 4 times the volume to earn on average just over half of what they earned 50 years earlier in 1951. That's the food system as it's evolved in Australia. So unsurprisingly, that has health consequences for our farmers. Rates of suicide and depression amongst farmers are more than twice the national average. We have a huge problem with health, with ill health, the types of foods that we're producing. All these grains, a lot of them are turned into, well, corn in particular in the United States, turned into high fructose corn syrup, which becomes laced through our processed food and fast food industries, and a major driver of the obesity epidemic and diabetes. I was reading some stats the other day that suggested that the cost to the Australian economy right now, including direct and indirect costs, is over $130 billion of that health crisis alone. Then we have hunger and food insecurity. You think of this as a majority world or southern problem, and indeed it is. There's 1 billion people, or nearly, between 800 million and 1 billion people who are hungry, which is itself an indictment on this food system that says it's so productive and efficient. And ironically, many of those people themselves are actually food producers and farmers. In Australia, though, Food Bank's latest figures suggest that we have over 500,000 Australians accessing emergency food relief every single month. Every month. A further 60,000 are being turned away because this massive growing network of food banks cannot cope with the demand. That is itself a consequence of a neoliberal state which is stripping back benefit systems and at the same time leading to asset inflation with the housing market and rents. And so people are struggling to access food, and certainly struggling to access good and healthy food. And then economically, we have, as I've said, this supermarket duopoly, 70 to 80% of the market. We have this ideological attachment to free trade and things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is really a charter of rights for transnational corporations that override our national sovereignty. We have political power of companies like Monsanto. And we have, lastly, the exploitation of workers. I've recently been in discussion with the National Union of Workers that have launched a campaign called Fair Food Campaign in the wake of a Four Corners program that some of you may have seen called Slaving Away. Did anyone see that last year? Looking at the mass exploitation of backpackers and migrant workers on horticultural farms in Australia. This is 2015. These people who are underpinning some of our food system being forced to work for 22 hours for $4 an hour on Australian farms today. Right, that's all the bad news. How long have I got now?
7. 7 minutes.
7 minutes, wow, that's great. Okay, so good news, right? There's a great story here, a really great. So all these issues have really given rise to a worldwide movement of resistance and innovation and creativity, and a lot of it has been led by farmers themselves who've experienced, as I've indicated, the sharpest end of this very oppressive system. So through cultural exchanges amongst women farmers in the late 1980s, just before the World Trade Organization came into being, they decided to create a worldwide farmers movement called La Via Campesina. Anybody heard of that? Yeah. So Spanish, meaning the farmer's path or the farmer's way. Now includes perhaps 200 million people in 80 countries around the world, including Australia. And it's one of its rallying cries has been around food sovereignty, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. Food sovereignty being a vision and a program for a democratic and participatory food system which really foregrounds the values of human health and well-being and ecosystem integrity, long-term thinking over short-term profit maximisation and control by corporations. That is the food sovereignty program. That's what Via Campesina represents. It's a food system that works for people and the planet. So this is what my work has been since coming back to Australia at the end of 2006, doing a PhD, learning about these things, and then working with others in northern New South Wales and then around the country to, in 2010, when the previous federal government launched its National Food Plan, to start what we called the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance. And then with the National Food Plan process, we found out that in Canada they'd done a great whole of country action research project called the People's Food Policy Project for Canada. So we thought, well, we don't have any money, but we have networks and we have activists and we have people who are passionate about these issues in farmers markets and community gardens right around the country. So we'll just put out a call and see what happens. And we had 40 public forums and over 600 people participated. And myself and Dr. Carol Richards, who's actually on the, no, she's not on your committee, is she? But she's a good friend, a comrade. Wrote it up into the People's Food Plan for Australia and published it in February 2013. Then, as was said, we decided to see how we could sort of keep this going, this social movement that we're trying to create, and make it real and make it accessible and understandable to lots of people in Australia, because food sovereignty isn't necessarily the most accessible term and requires some explanation. But fair food, fairness, is a term we think that really resonates with Australians. It's in our national anthem, it's in a lot of our folk sayings. We're supposed to be the land of the fair go, fair day's work for a fair day's pay, etc. So we've embraced this language around fair food, and that's what we're calling this movement of transformation that we're trying to build in Australia. So we have a Fair Food Week. It's a website, fairfoodweek.org.au, and we did it for the first time in 2013, done it twice since. It's an invitation for anyone around the country who identifies with what we're saying here to organise events, be they visits of community gardens, be they dinners, discussions, workshops, films, farm dinners, you name it, you think of it, you do it. You just register as an event organiser on that website, and it's a big national convergence right around the country. That'll be in October this year as well. We have, as been said, created a documentary. We crowdfunded over $35,000 from 263 Australians to make the first food politics film, Fair Food, telling particularly the story of regenerative farmers in Australia and the changes they're making on the land, people like Colin Syce. And we have the book, the anthology, that was published by UQP last September. So we're trying to build here a narrative and a vision and a platform of change that really tells stories by Australians for Australians, because a lot of the reason we made the film is because a lot of the films that have come out in this field, Food Inc., for example, they're films about Americans talking about America, which are great and inspiring, but we need to tell our own stories to ourselves and be inspired by ourselves, and that's why we're doing this. And the really exciting news, I think, is that the Victorian Curriculum Authority did a big review of the food tech subject in secondary schools across Victoria over the last 18 months and decided to totally revamp that curriculum and transform it from something simply being about cooking to a food literacy curriculum. In fact, it's actually called Food Studies. So from next year, every Year 11 and Year 12 student in Victoria will have the option of taking a Food Studies curriculum, which I think is hugely exciting. The message I want to leave you with is really one of hope and inspiration, but also a call to action, a call to arms, and to say that, you know, the future is open and it's up to us to create it. And we can be shaping our own history and our own future in conversations like these, in towns like Mullumbimby, and in other places right around Australia. A couple of verses that I want to leave you with on that theme. One was from England from 1812, Percy Bysshe Shelley. And you'll forgive me if I don't remember the exact title of his poem. It's quite a long one, but this is the stanza that always stands out for me, which I love. And it goes like this. Rise like lions from slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. One more. And this is going back in history. This is Rumi, a Sufi mystic from the 13th century. And this is really speaks to me. You were born with potential. You were born with goodness and trust. You were born with greatness. You were born with wings. You are not meant for crawling, so don't. You have wings. Learn to use them and fly. Thank you.
So now we'd like to welcome Helena Norbert Hodge to the stage. And Helena is a pioneer in the new economy movement. She's the producer of the award-winning The Economics of Happiness and author of Ancient Futures. She is founder, director of Local Futures. The relationship between the neoliberal economy and food has been a focus of Helena's work for almost 40 years, including 2 books, From the Ground Up, Rethinking Industrial Agriculture and Bringing the Food Economy Home. Let's give a warm Mullumbimby welcome to Helena Norbert Hodge.
All right, well, thank you so much, Nick. He has said roughly half of what I was going to say, so I'm very grateful to him for his fabulous work, and I hope that he'll be coming back to this area very often to help strengthen our efforts here. Because I want to say that if we fix food, we basically fix our future. There is no other issue, there is nothing else that affects every single aspect of life on Earth. There is no other issue that is as important as transforming the food system. The global food system, which separates us from the sources of our food, longer and longer distances, as Nick was pointing out, born of slavery, colonialism, genocide, tremendous corruption. That distancing and those large players who have become the middlemen, the multinationals, are imposing monoculture worldwide, not just a biological monoculture, but a human monoculture. Monoculture is antithetical to the basic foundations of life. Life is and needs diversity. Diversity is an absolute cornerstone and essential principle of life. We essentially have today a system that is a war against life. And of course we see it in terms of the toxicity. We see how the toxic pollution gives rise to cancer, a whole range of other illnesses. We see the extinction of species that will never come back again. And we can feel desperate, we can feel overwhelmed, we can feel depressed. I believe that if we can engage in what I call big picture activism, really look at the bigger picture in order to see where are the key threads, the key points that we can pull on to affect the whole system. If we can do that, we will be able to make shifts that could actually lead to very rapid healing. And we're talking not just about ecological healing, we're talking about human healing. The food system, which we can see right now in the so-called global south or the third world, being transformed in the way that we were transformed over the past many hundred years. We see this corporate food system driving people off the land into larger and larger mega cities. I have witnessed this process and worked with groups from every continent, all around the world. By the way, Via Campesina is the biggest social movement in the world. And yet, until recently, most people had not heard of it. There are hundreds of millions. I mean, the estimates are literally go between 3 and 500 million small farmers in associations from every continent. They were formed in opposition to the trade treaties. And this, by the way, should be a very big hint to us why focusing on the trade treaties is so important when we do a systemic analysis. In order to fix the food system, and with that, fix so many other of the serious crises we face, in order to fix it, we need to let our voices be heard in opposition to the ratification of further treaties that take power further and further away from us. These treaties, in the name, they sound friendly. Global trade treaties, what's wrong with that? Everything is wrong with that. They are about giving Monsanto, McDonald's, Walmart more freedom. Free trade treaties means free global trade. Those same corporations are lobbying our governments to introduce stronger and stricter and more bureaucratic regulations at the local and national level, so that they are systematically so overburdening local and national producers and businesses of every kind that the reaction is a sort of Trump Tea Party reaction, which is government out of the way. We don't want government. We want freedom. We urgently need to get an analysis out to explain that the big problem is not big government, although big government can be a big problem. The big problem is the big mobile banks and businesses that have been gaining more and more freedom. The trade treaties contain clauses called ISDS clauses, investor-state dispute settlement clauses, which give the corporations the right to sue our government if they do anything that might impede their profit-making potential. So I hope you will really keep this in mind, that focusing on the trade treaties, building a movement to counter those trade treaties is becoming very, very easy because they threaten our jobs, or everybody's livelihood is on the line. Governments are becoming poorer and poorer, more indebted, because the freedom of banks and speculation, the creation of money by the speculators for the benefit of large corporations, is driving this system where a few billionaires and trillionaires take everything and governments are impoverished as well as individuals. So we have an opportunity like never before to bring together across individual concerns, people concerned with unemployment, poverty, insecurity, people concerned with ecocide, with climate change, with the loss of democracy. All of those interests can come together to resist, to say no to a further deregulation. In the meanwhile, we can do so much to fix the food systems. Again, if we have a really clear systemic analysis and see that we can argue right here in Mullumbimby, right here in the Barren Shire, that the most strategic thing you can do to do your bit to reduce climate change, to reduce the mountains of plastic, to reduce toxic pollution, to reduce the dependence on GMOs. All of that is helped and solved through building local food economies. It's the best thing you can do for wildlife. Because by localizing, by shortening the distances, we structurally promote diversification of the land. We bring back agricultural biodiversity, and in so doing, we reduce the ecological footprint. The local food systems actually produce more food per unit of land and water, as Nick was pointing out, more food per unit of land and water than large monocultures ever can do. They can't begin to compete. But we don't get to hear that. We get to hear, we need large farms, we need the supermarkets to feed the world. That is bullshit. We need urgently to move towards the smaller, the more diversified, and we're going to hear more from local activists who are working to promote this right here in our area. I also want to tell you that one of the best things you can do to reduce terrorism and immigration, war, racism, ethnic friction, is to support local food economies here and in Guatemala, India, around the world. I've witnessed how this incredible pressure on people to leave the land, to leave relative self-reliance, often not very successful these days after years of colonialism and so on, but in the name of development, often with very good intentions. Even many of us will be actually helping people to move into the city, to realize a dream that is being foisted on them through the media. The media holds up an urban consumer monoculture. It's fundamentally Western, it's blue-eyed, blonde, and very sexy, and it takes different forms, a little bit in Bollywood, in China, but the basic message is, if you're on the land, you're an animal, you're an anachronism. You're just going to be left behind. You better do everything you can to borrow money, get your child into a good school so they can get a job in the city. This pressure on people to follow a monocultural stereotype, which is not them, not their language, not their skin color, is a disaster, especially for men. It's destroying self-respect. And as they follow that path, go into the city, searching for those jobs, you'll often have queues, you'll often have 10,000 people looking for one job. What's happening as part of the dynamic, as Nick was saying, it's a machine. The machine that generates the speculative money that's becoming more and more irresponsible is pushing not only a path of monoculture, but a path that uses ever more energy and technology and employs fewer and fewer people. This path is complete suicide on a planet where we have a problem with climate change and energy consumption and unemployment. We urgently need to be shifting subsidies, regulations, and taxes to support a path in the opposite direction. And that is the localizing path. When you rob men of their self-respect and their ability to provide for themselves and their own children, it's a recipe for violence. The violence often means that they turn on their own communities, on children, women, and the other, the migrant, the enemy who's taking the job. It is a recipe for violence, ethnic friction, and terrorism. But we can, when we step back and look at this in a holistic way, a systemic way, big picture way, we can feel very inspired. We can feel very hopeful. Because as Nick and I were saying earlier, we are amazed by the incredible proliferation of local food initiatives around the world. It is amazing what's happening. So much more than you can dream of. Just yesterday I found out about a new project in England. Well, new, it started like 4 or 5 years ago. I never heard of it. It's called Totally Locally, and it's making fabulous headway in rebuilding local towns and cities, reconnecting. People are reconnecting to community, to the land. The reconnection is what it's all about. It's what all the spiritual traditions remind us of. the fact that we are interdependent, we are one, we are connected. But this way, in the global system, we're connected to one another via huge exploitative commercial entities. As we re-establish our direct connections, we regain our energy, we regain our joy, we regain our humanity. The antidote, not only to terrorism, to ethnic friction, but even to greed and competition, is the rebuilding of human-scale communities at the local level, worldwide. And it is being demonstrated right now. I very much hope that you will join the movement. We're developing an economics of happiness workshop that maybe some of you would be interested in. The key elements that we encourage people to think about, there's 5 things that we need to do in response to this big system, not to get overwhelmed and depressed, but to actually do something really strategic. The first thing we say is connect. Connect with others. Change the I to a we. Don't allow the dominant system to keep telling you that you're going to shop your way out of these problems, that you're going to be forced to buy the ever more expensive, ever more ecological local product. Connect and start building the structures that will allow us to have the natural and the local be far cheaper than the global and the processed. Connect, and the second thing is educate. See education as activism, educating ourselves and others. There's a huge area, which is what Ngara is about. It's about rethinking basic assumptions. That activism of rethinking is more urgently needed than ever before. We are just bombarded with misguided and often out of good intentions, that we keep getting side issues that become blown up into the center of our political landscape, that polarize us, that separate us, take us away from the real issue. So educate ourselves and in an activist way spread the word. Support Ngara, support those voices that are trying to counter the dominant neoliberal propaganda. We need both resistance and renewal. So it's connect, educate, resist, and renew. The resistance, don't be afraid of it. The resistance to a great extent is also the intellectual resistance. It's letting our voices be heard. It's helping to get those internet links out. It's helping to get the emails out. It's helping to have meetings like this. We need many more meetings like this. The resistance also means being willing to go to Bentley and to help stop the wider expansion of this global system. Renew. The renewal is really central around food, but building local community, local business structures, local finance is what can heal, is what can help us connect. And finally, number 5 is celebrate. Celebrate the joy that comes from reconnecting to life, to one another, to nature, to actually feeling part of what is alive. We can do that very quickly, very easily. It doesn't have to cost money. Getting together to hike, to meditate, to sing, to really have a deeper dialogue about who we really are, what we really care about. Let's move away from that consumer culture which would have us pretend that we are perfect just the way we are. We don't need anybody. We need one another, so let's connect and let's celebrate. Thank you.
So now we're going to introduce the very famous Ian Cohen, who is going to come up and facilitate a panel of various local people. And I'd just like to say about Ian that he's an environmental and social change activist. He had 2 8-year terms on the New South Wales Legislative Council. He joined the Greens in 1984. He's now retired. Now, I don't know if all of you know about Ian Cohen, but If you don't, I'd just like to show you these two pictures, because this was Ian hanging on to the front of this ginormous US destroyer, Oldendorf, in 1986. It was a nuclear ship and he was protesting nuclear warheads. So not many of us have got the guts to do this. So let's have a warm welcome for Ian.
Thanks for the intro, and it really was very inspiring to hear the earlier speakers. Fantastic. We might get a few more words of wisdom from Nick as well as he joins the panel. And I think it's important to recognise at this time it's very easy to get somewhat defeated. I know in my 16-year term of being a member of Parliament, which was a bit of an aberration from being an activist, I was told by the dole office I really didn't have any opportunity to do anything worthwhile in life. I might as well just stay on the dole, and so I was left with little opportunity other than to become a politician. So having done that, I certainly witnessed a great deal, and I deliberately wrote Ian MacDonald into my bio, because when you see the amount of power that is involved in the Australian context, a democracy, with completely, utterly selfish, corrupt individuals like Ian MacDonald, Eddie Obeid, and a few other of his cohort, in a democracy, it just makes one shudder when you think of the Guatemalan experience, which I was there in the 70s and saw the oppression that was being undertaken, to recognise how difficult it is to change the system. But I equally believe, and it was fantastic what Helena and Rick were both saying, globally there are so many efforts of little people like clouds of mosquitoes sort of sending the beast of the capitalistic monopoly berserk with their irritating, annoying and sometimes deadly disease effects. And I think one of the places where we've been able to do that with huge success has been in the north of New South Wales, in this immediate area here. I can still see people in the audience that were at the Terania Creek campaigns, early rainforest campaigns, and we did a lot. We fought way above our weight to actually change the world, and I think that's where we've got to go with the food experience. I'd just like to introduce first Joel Orchard, and I'm told that's his original family name. Joel's a local new school farmer, food systems activist, passionate advocate for young farmers and networking. He's interested in exploring the social sustainability of local food production and tackling the issues of an ageing farmer population. Joel has been instrumental in establishing Future Feeders, a young farmers hub, peer support and community farming program based primarily at the Mullumbimby Community Gardens. Joel, what can we do in Byron Shire to connect up the youth, the farmers, and get things really moving in terms of productivity, both for individuals and also the farming sector?
I think we're all pretty aware that there's a really significant issue with the ageing farmer population. It's not just an Australian issue, and it's certainly being tackled all over the world. The average Australian farmer is about 56, 57, and over the last 25 years we've seen an enormous downturn in the number of new farmers taking on that as a profession. So I really saw there was a need to try and inspire and to generate interest in this field again. And I think what's become clear to me was that the old get big or get out metaphor for farming really needs to be turned around to get small and stand tall, and really try and inspire young people to tackle farming in a completely different way and regain the pride that really should exist for somebody who can manage the land sustainably or in fact regeneratively, and take on the custodianship of our beautiful local region quite seriously, and turn this into a place that Australia knows as a really beautiful place with clean food and a clean economy. Future Feeders was established in 2014 down at the Mullumbimby Community Gardens, and I guess the project has really been about trying to provide a peer-to-peer support program for young people who are interested in getting into farming as a career. And I don't really see the TAFE colleges and universities offering anything that's at all practical enough to really get young people on the ground and get their hands dirty and get into farming in a really real way. And as Ian pointed out, I guess I am a bit of a realist in that way, and I like to walk the talk as much as talk it, and I think there's really no way of being able to create change unless we actually do it. So trying to get young people into farming has been, in one way, a battle, but I think there's certainly an enormous movement in the US through the Greenhorns and the National Young Farmers Movement. I'd really like to emulate that here, and I guess that's why I've sort of tried to get the Northern Rivers Young Farmers Alliance alive and try to get young farmers collaborating, talking, sharing, skills sharing, sharing resources, trying to create a more collaborative economy around food. Future Feeders also tried to offer an opportunity for young people to start to look at the old models of cooperation, which I think we've got good examples of Norco, which is a great farmers cooperative, and the old models of where farmers used to work together, share together, and benefits from resource sharing and the productivity that comes with not everybody having to lash out for expensive pieces of equipment, which at this point are really making farming a real challenge to get into for young people who just don't have the capital to start off with. The other issue that we're facing is the destruction of the family farming model, where young people are no longer inheriting or taking on the family farm, and a lot of those beautiful pieces of productive agricultural land are being sold off, as we're certainly seeing in this region, to pretty much wealthy people from the city who don't really regard the land as being important for food production. And I think in a lot of ways it's important that we try to regain the land for its true purpose. My other involvement in trying to get the Byron Region Food Sovereignty Network together, which really represents all of the things that Nick and Helena have talked about in terms of trying to tackle the issues of capitalism and how that's completely ruined our food system in terms of its distribution and production all the way through. It was a real response to, I think, a discussion that Paul and I had, that there really was an amazing amount of projects which are being undertaken in this region, specifically by young people who are perhaps not heard as loudly because they're young and often they don't come with a lot of money to put behind their brands and their products, and really work out how do we get these people to start working together and tackle these issues with greater force and ferocity by working together and sharing again. So I think the key for, especially for young people, is trying to decentralise ideas and decentralise the way that we target these problems and work more collaboratively and collectively, and hopefully all benefit together. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Joel. I guess just one very short question, perhaps a short answer. What can this sort of audience do to help you and your organisations and young farmers in this immediate area?
I guess a good example, and something I've tried to instigate at Future Feeders, is what's called a CSA, or a Community Supported Agriculture model, which is certainly popular in the US. It's certainly popular in the UK. It came from Japan, I think, originally, but basically unheard of in Australia. And for me, what's key is the consumer taking not only control but responsibility for their food, and how the farmers are supported. I think the farmers markets are a wonderful model and have certainly led the way in terms of getting people connected to their food again, but unfortunately still perpetuated this culture of we pay and walk away, and the responsibility of the farmer's success and security has been forgotten. If the farmer goes through a bad season of flood or pest, they might financially fail and it could ruin them. But through a CSA model where the consumer takes a stake or a sense of responsibility for not only the way that the food is produced, but how the farmer is supported in that operation, it puts the power back in the hands of the consumer, and the farmer is nourished and everybody benefits. So those sort of models, I think, are great ways for the consumer to get definitely more in touch with the source of their food, not only through the earth itself, but the hands that grow it, and really puts people back in control.
Right. Next speaker is Paul Gribar. He's been working with the Byron Hinterland Seed Savers for the last 4 years, strengthening capacity to attract a broader demographic into seed saving and gardening. He's passionate about more food and more diversity in this food being grown in gardens throughout our regions through the free exchange of seeds, plants and knowledge. Further to this, he's been working with Santos Organics in various roles. His passion here lies in encouraging people to be aware of the impact of their spending. As a social enterprise, 100% of their proceeds after operating and internal expenses are invested in not-for-profit organisations which are focused on social and or environmental issues. Currently, one project they are looking at is the support of the Northern Rivers Young Farmers Alliance and Future Feeders to engage more young people in farming and provide them with access to certified organic land, interest-free loans and a direct market for their produce.
The participation of more of the community in these issues is where the change is going to happen. And the two things that stand out to me predominantly is that there is that disconnect with our food. Both Helena and Nick spoke about it, how the foods, a lot of the communities are disconnected from their food system, which is disconnection from the earth, which is disconnection from their livelihood and their health. So by turning up tonight, everyone here is participating in creating something new, and I feel that's probably one of the most important actions that we can all do is continue to participate in whatever way we can to strengthen this movement. Each one of us has a role within our community to stand against the destructive actions that are taking place on the global level, the national level, the local level, etc. And the more of us are involved, the more that system doesn't hold the power, and the system of the people does hold the power. So connecting to your community is really such a powerful thing to do, because there's nothing that speaks louder than word of mouth. And I guess my focus with the Byron Hinterland Seed Savers, which was started by RASA, who operate under the Seed Savers network of Jude and Michelle Fanton, I really saw an opportunity for more of our community to come together and connect based around the concept of food. And by using that sort of platform to come together, we started sharing seeds and plants, and a lot of the older gardeners who'd been doing it for a long time came together and started sharing their wisdom to younger gardeners. And it really created this connection between a broader demographic of the community, which I felt was a strong move for any community to do, really creating that connection to each other and back to the earth and to the food system. So to get people out of the mainstream way of consuming their food, I feel those connection points, whether it's at a Seed Savers meeting, at an evening like this, at a Fair Food Week dinner, or any sort of event that really focuses on a small action that can plant a seed for a larger action to take place, is such a powerful thing to do. You never know the ripple effect of a really small action you put in place today.
Thanks, Paul. The next speaker is Alison Drover. Alison has designed and taught workshops for the Environment Protection Authority's Love Food Hate Waste program throughout the Northern Rivers. Alison was involved in Sydney's Fair Food Alliance and co-managed the Slow Food Sydney Convivium for 5 years, and was actively involved in campaigns including sustainable seafood, GM foods, and designed numerous food events that champion the importance of local food sustainability and farmers. Alison, when we look at schools, hospitals, underprivileged, the healing art of food supply, perhaps you can expand a little on that with your dreams and how you'd like to see the society go, food as a healer.
Well, thank you, and thanks for everybody coming along. Look, I will, but just briefly, I suppose one of the ways, and Ian mentioned things like hospitals, schools, caterers, they're often the ones that don't have local food. And one of the difficulties is how they actually get access to it. As a local people, we can go to farmers markets and we can buy local food fairly easy. But if you're a caterer or a business or a school, it's actually quite the ordering systems and the distribution systems, it all gets very complicated, and that's often why large state organisations don't buy locally. So just to paint the picture of what could happen in the future to actually help this, would be we've seen a revolution in technology in terms of, Airbnb and Uber and all these types of things. But what we haven't seen is really a revolution online for food. And that is an online platform that directly connects farmers to consumers. Because one of the difficulties with local food systems, all the farmers markets are wonderful, the local food hubs that are emerging, all these things, but I think even Joel will testify, sometimes these things are actually very difficult to be sustaining. They require huge amounts of capital, huge amounts of resources, and often we're replicating systems in every different enterprise. And for a small-scale farmer starting out, if he's got to go and buy the equipment and the software and set up a distribution system and learn to market, he's not been a market, he's a farmer, all these things are really time-consuming and expensive. But if you could actually have a farmer being directly connected to a consumer, and I'm just painting the picture here of what's starting to happen is there's transport systems running around the country already that go from one place to another, delivering things with empty loads on their trucks. Now, if farmers could hook into that system, and small-scale farmers, and with an online system that was really well organised, and say, look, there's a spare pallet going from there to there, suddenly a small farmer becomes viable. So I think one of the issues coming forward is to actually how we simplify this and make it easier so that we can get foods, airlines, hospitals, all those other areas that actually really need local food and good food, being able to buy it. And a couple of the things you can look up if you like, there's a new platform called Farmers Web. There's another one called Planet Table. But this is taking it to a greater platform. And I think it's really going to revolutionise some of the things that we're having issues with at the moment.
But big food industry here in Australia is very powerful, very pervasive, and has the ear of government constantly. What do you think in this area here would be the most effective way forward to sort of shake ourselves loose from that, to gain control?
I think in the last few weeks the state government here has passed legislation which is effectively criminalising the sorts of courageous activism that you highlighted in the Lock the Gate movement. There's a new raft, I'm sure you all probably know about this, but a new raft of very authoritarian legislation coming through, not just in New South Wales but in Western Australia and Tasmania as well, criminalising democratic community action. In terms of what we can do, what farmers can do, I think support, communities can work together to support farmers, the sorts of great work that Joel's doing and been talking about. But also, I think at the local government level, there's real scope for action. And this morning, after I left the Steiner School here in Mullumbimby, I drove up to Mullumbimby and met with a number of staff and managers at Tweed Council. And they are going to release on Tuesday next week this draft Tweed Sustainable Agriculture Strategy coming out for public consultation next week. And it's got some really good things. So the Mayor, Katie Milne, has said the future of the Tweed will depend upon an agricultural sector providing increased employment and career opportunities, economic stimulus and stewardship of the natural environment. Sustainable agriculture is good for the environment, profitable and socially responsible. It is the natural resource base that supports community well-being and a strong economy. Healthy landscapes are productive landscapes. So this is great to hear a local council in Northern Rivers saying these sorts of things. So one of their key strategies under this, one of their key actions under this strategy is local sustainable agricultural production is valued, recognised and promoted by the community with widespread consumption of local products. So I think this is a council in the Northern Rivers that's showing real leadership and really getting behind its agricultural community and its farmers and listening and using its capacity as a council to really make some changes. So if the Byron Council doesn't have a sustainable agriculture strategy or a food strategy, then I think that's something as residents and ratepayers here that you could encourage them to do. And on a related note, I left a document on a few tables, the Urban and Regional Food Declaration, which is a bit of a kind of like a manifesto vision statement that we're trying to encourage lots of organisations and councils to sign up to as a common platform and vision for change and a shared language and about these sorts of principles that we've been talking about tonight. So that has been endorsed by the City of Melbourne, by Mornington Peninsula Shire Council, by the City of Geelong, by the City of Greater Ballarat. and Tweed Council are going to put it on their agenda, and I'd encourage you to also put it on the agenda of Byron Council and other councils in this region.
Thanks very much, Rick. Now,
probably all five of you are very aware that the meat industry is one of the most destructive forces on the planet, and yet even here in this room there's a lot of people who eat a lot of meat.
They are eating meat, they are more aware of where it comes from and it being ethically farmed. You're not going to turn people overnight to stop eating meat, and I think it's better to sort of to just focus on the things you can focus on. If somebody's comes to a class with me and they've got a family and they're not eating properly, but all they know how to cook is meat, well, at least they're feeding their family. So I think we've got to deal with the meat thing in a context and deal with it chunk by chunk, which is a very bad way of dealing with that one. It is a major problem, and I'm completely with you. But I think if we get focused on any issue, it's like people say to me, why is Jamie Oliver sort of sold his soul to go and help Woolworths? Well, maybe he has, but in many ways, Jamie Oliver's done incredible things, and I'm not a fan of celebrity chefs, but he actually has, even though he's gone and worked for Woolworths. If you look at the way he's addressed one piece of the big puzzle that we're all trying to as Helena says, share and connect and deal with, he's helped raise awareness for sugar foods. He's actually raised welfare issues of meat and things in supermarkets and things. So yes, he is working for one of the offenders, but he's doing a small part he's doing a big part in that actually. So I think it's looking in the context of a bigger picture.
I think as a staunch vegetarian myself, even I've had to become aware that there's incredible potency for raising the vitality of the land through using regenerative practices and holistic management of livestock. And I mean, that was something that I hadn't necessarily looked into, but once I've realised the potency that ethical management of livestock and its ability to lock carbon into the soil and improve soils and all other manners of nutrient and land vitality, I think we can probably start to look at the issue from different perspectives and perhaps just apply a different tact to the problem.
I haven't been able to sell my produce at the local farmers markets, and I want to know, how do we encourage these organisations to be less afraid and to be more open?
I totally agree with you, and I know it's a bit controversial, but sometimes the farmers markets, while they get accoladed even throughout the community, it is a huge problem because in many ways, and when I went and talked before about that distribution system, farmers markets are fantastic and they're lovely places to shop and things, but farmers get up really early in the morning, they drive all the way there, they work long hours, they don't have lives sometimes with their families, they're exhausted, then they've got to go back and farm. It's a better way for a farmer to be on his farm doing what he does best and somebody else worrying about the distribution system and the stuff going directly to him. But in answer to your question, it is a problem in this area. We are becoming like the supermarket. We're limiting our access to diversity. And I know there's sort of one type of, I won't mention it, products at the market. And if you go to France, I grew up in Papua New Guinea, I know there'd be, lines and lines and lines of things. And so in many ways, what are farmers markets doing? They're guilty of what supermarkets are doing. There is the power, is being held in the hands of a few. And supply is limited, so when things sold out, you come in as a consumer. I know a lot of people that come to my class and they say, we are trying to do what you're telling us to do, buy local. But when I get there, they're sold out, or they don't have what I want. And so these are huge issues, and we're not actually helping farmers that Joel is actually teaching to nurture along. They haven't got farmers markets originally were places for people to go with their product and sort of get a step up, not for people to start to be growing their enterprise, so their huge businesses and not allowing new shoots to come through. So I think this is something that is a bit controversial, but something that needs to be really looked at in this community, because it's certainly not helping the consumers. There's not enough biodiversity. We want 5 different cheese makers, and we want to reward those people. We want transparency, and we want new people like you coming there. So I think this is something that if it comes up for debate in the community, people need to not be sort of so cushy-coo about the farmers markets. I think we need to sort of delve a bit deeper about what's happening there.
question. I've had exactly the same experience, and it's really challenged me as someone who's looking for, I guess, the easier options in terms of trying to get a leg into the industry. The farmers markets traditionally are the first place of call for a new or a startup farmer. I think perhaps the farmers markets are in some ways shooting themselves in the foot in that they're stopping more innovative and interesting ideas and other farmers who perhaps only grow a small number of more unique products and make the whole experience of the farmers markets more interesting. And so I think their fear is that if they encourage too many or open the doors completely wide to all manner of farmers to turn up, that there'll be a dilution of the capacity for all the farmers to find a proper income from the experience. But in a lot of ways, if they reverse their ideology on it and did open the door to a lot more exciting and novel options for the consumers, probably a lot more people would go. So I think in all ways there needs to be a balance. And it's certainly something that I think that the farmers markets need to explore in terms of being a bit more creative and modernising their process, because I mean the farmers markets is not a novel idea in itself, but we can take a novel approach to how we operate a farmers market. And perhaps in all things that we've said, what really needs to happen is food distribution and food production needs to be put in the hands of the consumers. We need to be able to have a democratic process where we can decide how it is that we want farmers markets to operate, how it is that we want farms and farmers to be producing food that nourishes our bioregion and nourishes us as individuals. So I think that's certainly a discussion that we should have and start to unfortunately wrestle control back from the hands of a few, even if they be the people that manage our farmers markets.
How do we actually put pressure to broaden the scope of the farmers market?
Small farmers who are struggling to survive, partly they have the problem that Ali was talking about, standing the whole day in the market. They often can't do that. And there's the problem that when the farmers alone run the market, they tend to be fearful of their very limited profit. I mean, we just can't blame them because they really are performing a service to us that's amazing. We should honor all of them. But just what Joel was saying, ideally we would be looking at how the community would get more involved in running the markets. And we need all of you to help to pressure for change and to really both towards diversification, towards opening up so that more growers, even those who produce very little, can have an opportunity. When we set up the rules, we try to make that possible, but it hasn't quite worked. There's also no reason why farmers who have a really tough day shouldn't be able to have someone represent them and sell their food. You know, there are many ways that the whole system is undermined because there isn't enough community involvement and we're not thinking enough about it. But I think this is a very good start, and I hope we can continue to really improve the community gardens as well as the farmers markets, as well as the school gardens. All of that needs to happen. Thanks.
Thanks, Helena. And might I just put a slight political edge to it. It's run by a committee. You've got to get in there and you've got to be able to get to a position of being able to influence, be part of the voting process to change that organisation too. It's like anything. I'm not saying with these farmers markets, but they get to a point where people get control and it can skew the original ideal. We've seen that in many a revolution around the world, and I think we are talking in revolutionary terms in terms of adequate supply, organic food, and adequate access by local growers. A very, very important issue. Thanks for the question. Just one more here.
With these anti-protest laws, we're looking at our seed being compromised.
What's the question?
The question is, how do we move forward with this with government? Because at a local level, yes, Mullumbimby is great, but I can also feel it possibly, again, that word being compromised, and it is filtering through. So how do we rise up against that?
In this area, you could just about say it's got that level of control because so many of the people don't vote. Our lack of action on that level is allowing the National Party, etc., and Labor to control the whole show. That's just me. I'm a politician, But I despair at the amount of goodwill people who don't register and step up to vote. Thousands of millions of people around the world are dying for the right.
I think it's a really important question, a really important topic. This is really, and we've sort of touched on it in different parts, but I think your question really brings it to the forefront, and it's important to say that this is really, and food sovereignty is really about democracy. It's what we're really talking about here, sort of the nature and quality of our democracy, and that is one of the, the worst impacts of neoliberalism, is that it's stripping back the content and the substance and the process of our democracy. This ever concentration of power economically is reflected in a concentration of political power and increasingly repressive political power. We've seen that, since the turn of this century, since the start of the war on terror, rafts of legislation that have been, criminalising different types of protests and different groups, and increasing surveillance and police state powers, and it's just, it just goes through waves and waves, and you think it's over, but it comes back. I met Steve Marsh, to bring it back to food and farming and agriculture and seed in Australia. Do people know who Steve Marsh is? Have you heard the name Steve Marsh? An organic farmer in the southwest of Western Australia, whose land was contaminated by genetically modified canola being grown by his neighbour, Michael Baxter. So he fought a long fight, supported by lots of people around the country, to really stand up to Monsanto, because it was portrayed as this kind of neighbour dispute between two farmers, but really it was this guy and the movement behind him against Monsanto, the company. I met him, and he showed me, and he talked to me, and he showed me documents his lawyers had obtained under Freedom of Information Act requests, which were emails going back and forth between Monsanto executives in Australia and senior bureaucrats in the Department of Agriculture in WA before the moratorium on GM canola was lifted in Western Australia. And I was reading it, and it was like they were part of the same organisation. It was at that level. It was like colleagues talking about their PR strategy and how they're going to manage the press and the public reaction when it was announced, and all these kinds of things. And the level of collusion and, frankly, corruption was astonishing. And Monsanto has acquired a big stake in Intergrain, which is like a major public breeding company, which really threatens our seed sovereignty and integrity. And their interest is purely, short-term financial gain, nothing more. Yet they dress it up in this language about feeding the world through this, this technology. I think we also have to realise that life doesn't begin and end with our wallets and our identity as consumers and shoppers, that we are, citizens in a democracy, or so-called, and we need to exercise those rights, because if we don't, we're going to lose them. And Karl Polanyi actually made this point back in 1944, before the first meeting of the neoliberal, cabal, who are dreaming up this system that we now live in. And he said that, there are good freedoms and bad freedoms, and this like a liberal utopia that these men are working on is the worst sort of freedom, and encouraging freedoms of avarice and greed and total self-interest, and that will only be sustained ultimately through repression and through silencing dissent and silencing political opposition, and it will tend towards a tyrannical and authoritarian and dictatorial form of government. And that is what we're seeing, I think, right now in lots of places around the world, through austerity policies, surveillance, and the emergence in the US elections right now of an openly fascistic candidate in the persona of Donald Trump, who is, peddling a very dangerous brand of right-wing populism that is appealing to people's real suffering in terms of the disenfranchisement and unemployment and poverty in that country, but diverting it down a very anti-democratic tendency. So we need to take this issue extremely seriously and get organised and work together, support networks here like the Byron Food Sovereignty Network, and take seriously this challenge to democratise our food systems, talk about the issues about the farmers' markets, talk about everything that's important, and raise your voices and work together as a citizenry, to say that, you're not going to be taken lightly, and you are aware of what's happening, and that you're not going to stand for it.
In the world that we live in now, the social media avenues allow you to communicate with hundreds, if not thousands of people in an instant. And that is such a powerful tool that if we use and use correctly, it does create massive change really, really quickly. So I'd all urge you to, if you're not using any of those tools yet, they may be really difficult to first understand and use, but once you do, really the information that's out there, the ability to connect with Nick, Joel, anyone within this room in an instant and share the information that you've heard tonight among all your friends and networks is literally a click of a button. So just recognise that your voice is very, very powerful, and the platforms out there right now make that readily available for you to share that among the 6 degrees of separation which can reach everyone in this world. So.
If anyone is interested in getting involved, the Byron Region Food Sovereignty Network is currently looking for expressions of interest for anyone who might like to be on the 2016 steering committee, and the application form, or just a little a few little details about yourself are on the futurefeeders.org website. So if anyone is interested in getting more involved with that organisation and sort of challenging some of the social norms that we've discussed here tonight, it would be great to hear from you. And if not, simply join us online on the Facebook pages and those sort of opportunities. So thank you.
Richard, over to you.
Our next event, which is in a month's time, is the amazing one and only Professor Stuart Rees, Emeritus Professor at the University of Sydney, the former head of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, which, as you may or may not know, is currently in the process of being dismantled by the university and partly as a result of public pressure too from certain quarters. He obviously plays a key role in the Sydney Peace Foundation, which, as you know, awards the annual Peace Prize. Stuart is an amazing guy, prolific writer, fantastic poet, great activist, very committed commentator, particularly on the question of Israel and Palestine. He'll be here in a month's time, and he'll be talking about the weapons industry and its link to the corporate sector, and how can we resist that particular industry. As we know, the Americans, as we speak, are supplying some of the most oppressive regimes in the world, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, with weapons on an unprecedented scale, and those weapons now being used to bomb the Yemenis almost into oblivion. And it's something we've really got to resist and fight. So thank you everybody for coming, thank you to the speakers, and hope you all had plenty of food, plenty of drink. Enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you.